Scream for me, Sarajevo. No, I didn't hear you. Scream for me, Sarajevo. There you go. Okay, today I'm going to talk to you about unity in diversity. I think that's probably because 25 years ago, I was one of the organizers of a concert right here in Sarajevo. In the middle of the Bosnian War, I and a colleague of mine, Martin Morris, brought Bruce Dickinson, one of the biggest heavy metal singers in the entire world, to Sarajevo. And that event, probably more than anything else in my life, it shows unity in diversity. Because the people who attended that concert, most of them probably weren't heavy metal fans. They were young, they were old, they were male, they were female, they were people of faith, and there were people of no faith. Truly unity in diversity. So today, I'm going to take a little bit of a different angle. I want to think about what gets in the way of unity in diversity. Let me just have a little show of hands here. Who admits that they're biased against other people? A few hands? Okay. So what I find usually when the discussion turns to unconscious bias is that people actually become quite defensive about the subject. They don't want to look bad in front of other people. So today I'm not going to talk about unconscious bias by way of the normal things that people talk about, the nationality, politics, religion. I'm going to talk about it in respect of music and film, social media. I'm going to talk about it in the workplace and in terms of our lives generally. And I'm also going to talk about sex. Let's think about biases first of all. You see, centuries ago, back in caveman times if you like, if you by accident, wandered into the middle of a different tribe, that could be detrimental to your survival. So, as a result, we built up biases against the unfamiliar. So that you can imagine that a child, for anyone who have children here in the audience, a 2-year-old child is often very, very scared of strangers. If we look at people who grow up not being exposed to people who don't look familiar, of other races, who speak with a different language, they can feel uncomfortable with them. But the opposite's also true. Because if you grew up in a loving family as a child, with a loving mother, you may find that actually you feel comfortable with women who resemble that family circle that you grew up with. Similarly, if you had a benevolent old grandfather with a big white bushy beard and a bald head, you might find that you feel comfortable with men who look like that. My children probably would feel quite familiar with Tom Hanks. But let's do another little experiment. These two circles are not equal. They're both very minutely different sized, and one's larger. And I want you to help me to discern which one is the larger one. So if you think it's the red circle, I want you to put your hand up. Yeah, a few people, red circle. If you think the blue circle is the bigger one, I want you to put your hand up now. Oh, lots more think it's the blue circle. And that's a really interesting one, isn't it? Because before I said anything about the circles being a different size, you probably thought they were equal. And that's in fact because they are equal. See, what just happened was that I manipulated you. And an interesting fact is that people seen as in a position of power actually can be very good at manipulating us. Now imagine if you were a child and you grew up thinking that blue circle was larger than the red one. Or what about if you grew up thinking that blue circle was better than the red one? That would be quite a difficult bias to break. So the key here is really to accept that you're only human, to understand, one, that that you hold biases. We all hold biases. And the second thing to understand is it's actually really very easy to manipulate you. Okay? So you really need to accept that you're only human. We're going to talk now about film. And for the older members of the audience, and I can see there are probably a few people who are older than me, but back in the 1980s, Steven Spielberg made a film about E.T., an extraterrestrial being. Now, if you look before that movie, extraterrestrial beings had always been portrayed as scary Martians. But the premise of this movie was that Spielberg needed you to believe that actually you liked this E.T. And that placed him in a difficult position because he knew that we'd been manipulated into holding a bias that extraterrestrial beings were scary. So he needed to change that bias in some way. So, how did he do that? Well, it's said that the approach that he took was to impose the face of a baby over the face of Albert Einstein. And therefore, well, let's go back one. Who doesn't like babies? Yeah, who hasn't smiled when a complete stranger with a baby's walked past and the baby's frowned and then given you a huge beaming smile? It's really hard as humans for us not to smile back. We're pre-programmed towards smiling back, towards feeling warmth to babies. And that's, again, a survival of the race thing, because back in caveman days, if there was a baby on the ground, it couldn't escape. So the baby is also pre-programmed into trying to break the ice. That's the big smile, and that's called a social releaser. So what Spielberg did when he created E.T. was he used those big eyes of a baby to manipulate us into thinking that E.T. was a likable extraterrestrial being. I want to talk now about the music industry, one of my pet subjects. Now, it's well known that the music industry, since the social networking and file sharing sites like Napster came along in the 1990s, that the music industry has struggled in many ways. I don't want to talk about those struggles today, but I want to talk about some of the other problems that the music industry's had. And so if I go back to when I was a young musician myself, I remember an old A&R man telling me, you've got a minute to grab your audience. A minute. So get to the chorus within a minute, because if you don't capture their imagination within that minute, you're going to lose them. They'll stop listening. Now, if we think about how people's mindsets have changed over the last 20 or 30 years, attention spans are much, much shorter. Honestly, I think we probably have seconds now to capture people's imagination, because they'll just flick the forward button on Spotify and listen to the next song in the playlist. And talking of playlists, another problem for the music industry is that we used to consume music, we used to hear new music on commercial radio. And that was really how we listened to music. I remember as a child that we'd have a radio on in the morning before I went to school, and that's how I would hear new music. But for the most part, that's not just how people consume music nowadays. They consume it in a very different way. Now, the really nice thing about radio was that the radio executives would choose what they thought were the best songs, and they'd put them into a playlist on rotation, so that the best songs, in their view, we would hear regularly. Now, if you take that into account, that they say it takes you 9 plays of a song to feel familiar about it, back then when we listened to commercial radio and we were listening to playlists, that was quite easy to capture people's imagination. Now, people consume music in a very different way, and therefore, it's very difficult to get those 9 plays. It's very difficult to get people familiar enough with your music to like it, and certainly familiar enough to buy it. So music producers and artists have to think about what's in their toolbox. What tools do they have to make people familiar with their music? And of course, your unconscious biases are one of those tools in their toolbox. They manipulate you just in the way that I manipulated you a few minutes ago. Now, let's just think about what unconscious bias they could manipulate. If we go back to the children thing, the children thing's a really good one. Go back to the children thing and think about either when you were a child or if you have children, if your child's upset, how do you calm them down? For centuries, people have sung lullabies, nursery rhymes, simple musical progressions. So imagine if you could, as an artist, take that simple musical progression, which has been programmed into people's minds worldwide, and you could create a song around a simple musical progression. They might not ever know that you tapped into that bias that you hold, that bias which makes you feel warm towards that song. It takes you to a comfortable place, makes you feel happy and warm and safe. But of course, so we can see that actually it's very easy for musicians and artists to manipulate us. Who's heard that song before? Who ever noticed that there was a lullaby as the central theme? No one. 300 people here, no one's ever noticed that before. It's really interesting, isn't it? So let's go from music and film towards real life now. What I want to talk about now is I want to talk about the workplace. I want to talk about real life, and as I think I mentioned at the start, I want to talk about sex right at the end. So in real life, if we think about the workplace for a second, because actually being manipulated in terms of film, in terms of music, it's actually not such a big deal, is it? Our unconscious biases really aren't affecting people adversely. But if we think about the workplace, there's some really interesting stuff around that. So I read a piece of research recently that said chief executives, male chief executives of companies, whose wives are executives themselves, will tend to surround themselves with a gender-diverse board of executives. But chief executives, male chief executives whose wife is a stay-at-home mother, tend almost exclusively to have all-male boards. Well, that's a really difficult bias to break, isn't it? And of course, that weakens the company itself, because a well-known British businessman recently said, a board with the brightest 10 middle-aged men in the world is inherently weaker than one with the brightest 10 people in the world, because it's a much bigger group. So I think a famous paraphrase, but a famous American politician once said, or differentiated between known knowns and unknown unknowns. And actually, it's really too easy to deal with the known knowns, but it's much harder to deal with the unknown unknowns. And because that chief executive, whose wife's a stay-at-home mother, doesn't even understand the concept, then it's much harder to deal with that as an unknown unknown. I want to talk about social media now. Now, social media in my view, is a really serious place where we've been manipulated, and our biases have been tapped into, and we've been manipulated on the basis of them. Let's call them dark forces. Dark forces around the world have understood that we're all biased. We're biased towards our own tribe. We're prejudiced against the other. And they've used that to their benefit to sow discord around the world. So when you see memes, when you see memes around the other being less civilized than us, they're less educated than us, they're somehow less human than us. Yeah, we know that our inherent biases are being manipulated against us, or once we understand we have inherent biases, we can understand that we're being manipulated. And there's the key for me. Can we do anything about being manipulated on the basis of our unconscious and inherent biases? Yes, I say we can, actually. So today I'm going to give you 4 steps that you can use when you're faced with something which might be tapping into your inherent biases. The first one is understand that you are biased. Hopefully you've all learned today that you are biased. And the first thing you've got to do is understand that, because you can never deal with it if you don't understand it. The second thing is to try and recognize when your biases have been triggered, and that's a difficult one. Yeah? But the third one is to challenge yourself. Because if you challenge yourself when you see a meme about the other or whatever, and say to yourself, well, is that actually true? Yeah, my bias is being triggered. I'm triggered against the other. But is it actually true? And there's an old adage, goes right back to the last century, Google's your friend. And the last one I'm going to talk about today is sex. Because I said right at the start I was going to talk about sex. I mentioned sex in the middle. Sex will be in the title, and indeed it's the most searched word on Google, I understand. And the really interesting thing about sex is I'm not going to talk about it today. But it's interesting how I'm manipulated to listen all the way to the end, isn't it? Thank you.